US Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell surprised the global markets this week after signalling interest rates may need to rise further this year and could stay at elevated levels for longer than expected. The rates decision comes at a critical time for President Joe Biden, who's been dealing with an automotive workers' strike, rising petrol prices and a low approval rating. Joining me now is Adam Creighton, Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper. Adam, thanks for your time. Let's start with the US Federal Reserve. Jerome Powell clearly still pretty worried about the economy. Rates are already at 22-year highs, but they could go higher again.
Yeah, certainly. We learnt from the meeting this week that most of the voting members think that rates will probably be higher and possibly one more increase this year. I mean, as you suggested, that's very bad news for President Biden because we're going into the 2024 election year and the administration will certainly be hoping that our rates fall during that period. But the current forecast is just for one or two cuts next year, which given the 5.5% level that they're currently at would still leave rates very high and would also leave, of course, a lot of angry Americans in a critical voting year. So the US economy is in a strange position, really. I mean, the jobless rate is very low, and certainly the White House likes to talk about that a lot. But we've just seen figures that show median household income in the US has fallen for the third year in a row. So I think that second fact, really explains why in surveys most Americans are pretty angry about the economy.
One problem, not only in America, but here as well, is oil prices. They're closing in on $100 a barrel. That obviously pushes up the cost of petrol, or gas as it's called in the States, transport costs. Is there a big fear here that inflation is going to be sticking around a lot longer than anticipated?
Well, look, certainly the headline inflation rate has come down a lot from more than 9% last year, I think, to about 3% now. But the underlying inflation rate has been fairly stubborn. It's still well above the 2% target rate, and I think the Fed is worried that higher level is going to become entrenched. And it's not just the oil prices. I mean, the price of houses in the US have gone up dramatically. The price of used cars. So if you're filling up your car, if you're buying a car, if you're trying to buy a house, or of course get a mortgage, where the 30-year mortgage rate is 7.6%. I think that's a 30-year high as well. So, there's a lot of pressure points in the US economy right now for ordinary families.
Yeah, right now in America, there's the auto workers' strike happening in Detroit. Someone on the ground in the States. It is a bit of a story here. How big of a deal is this in America?
Well, look, it could be a very big deal next week because former President Donald Trump on the 27th of September, he's actually going there to give a speech to the auto workers, which is something that you never normally see from a Republican leader speaking to union workers. The top of the union leadership is very pro-Democrat, but I think Trump probably rightly senses that a lot of the workers support him. And indeed, the broader debate here is the push for electric cars. And Trump makes the case that this legislative push is actually going to wipe out a lot of these auto jobs in coming years. And, there is some argument that that's right. So, I mean, it's a very political issue. I mean, the union's been fairly careful so far. It hasn't actually shut down all the plants. It's only shut down a handful of plants. But nevertheless, thousands of workers involved, of course. It could get worse. We have to wait and see.
Look, something else Jerome Powell mentioned this week was US student loan repayments. They restart in October. They've been on hold during the COVID period. But is this going to do anything to economic demand?
Well, look, it probably will because those payments have been on hold for 3 years or so now. I think it's in aggregate hundreds of billions of dollars that is going to be diverted from spending in the economy to repaying this debt. And so that's just going to be a further hit that economists will be worried about going into next year. I mean, you've still got strong spending in the US, strong consumption, and that's largely because of those massive fiscal handouts over the last few years. But they are almost whittled down to zero soon. And so at the same time as you've got that, you've got falling real wages, you've got high interest rates. There is a fear that the economy could crash next year.
Yeah, and how much blame is now President Joe Biden getting for America's economic struggles over the past few months when you look at where the country's at?
Well, somewhat bizarrely, he's kind of claimed it all as his doing. He calls it Bidenomics, which is a strange political strategy because most Americans, as I said, are quite angry with the economy, and yet he talks about it a lot as if it's much better. And look, true, it is better, than it was 2 years ago. But the fact is prices are still rising. The inflation rate is still positive. So, I think there's a lot of anger out there. And I think, as always, whether it's Australia or the US, ordinary people tend to blame the government for whatever is happening in the economy.
Look, you mentioned the 2024 election. It's about 14 months away. President Biden's 80 years old, already the oldest US president in history. Do you think he really has the stamina for another 4 years?
Well, look, I said a few months ago, I don't think he'll be the candidate. I mean, it's a bit of a stab in the dark, but it's just hard to see. I mean, the appearance of decline, at least, has gotten so bad that it's a huge liability. And as you say, 14 months away, he's going to be older still, and he's not going to be any better by then. So I tend to think sometime early next year, or maybe even later this year, he'll say that he's going to stand down at the end of his first term. But look, it's very difficult because Kamala Harris, the vice president, she's even more unpopular, and so Democrats don't want to lose the election next year. So they're in quite a pickle, really. Of course, it looks increasingly certain that Trump is going to win the Republican nomination. So, it's going to be exciting times next year. Maybe that's the wrong word.
No, it should be very interesting to see how it all plays out, obviously, over the next 14 months or so. But on Trump, the former president, he's obviously had a few legal issues this year and is going to be appearing in various courts. But is that actually helping add to his image and build up his branding again in the eyes of the American public?
Well, look, I mean, I think in private he'd say these are not good things for him. But, I mean, he likes to make out that it's helped him. And indeed, his polling has gone up. I mean, after every indictment, his polling goes up amongst Republicans, not necessarily amongst the broader population, but certainly amongst Republicans. It's costing him a lot of money too. That's one big downside. I mean, the legal fees are very hefty, and he's having to divert funds that would be otherwise used for campaigning. So I mean, I think overall it's a negative. But that said, he looks almost certain to be the candidate. And if you look at nationwide polls that posit a hypothetical rematch, he's often ahead of Biden, which is pretty remarkable, given all the drama around January the 6th and the election. But yeah, I mean, he could win this thing.
And Adam, I think you were there for the previous election. Just talk us through the process, like how far out from November does it all really kick off?
Well, the primary season starts in January next year. So that's when each of the respective parties choose their candidate. And of course, for the Democrats, it's pretty much sewn up. It's going to be Joe Biden unless there is a backroom deal, as we referred to before. And the Republicans are the same. But I mean, it looks like those primary processes are going to be pretty boring at this stage because the two leaders are so far ahead. 14 months, it's a long way away. It's just a reminder of, the political cycle of the US is very long and constant. We're talking about the presidential election every week, and yet it's still so far away. But the stakes are so high, and that's why it's so important. But 3 months out is too hard to predict, let alone 14 months. So we should be careful in our predictions.
Adam Creighton, the Australian correspondent in Washington DC. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks.